Good evening and welcome. I'm so happy that all of you are here. My name is Austin Walker. I'm the Associate Director of the Lumen Christi Institute. And I'd like to begin this conversation, if you don't mind, with the old prayer before work or study that one of my mentors, Father Paul Mankowski, longtime LCI scholar in residence, would always use when he opened one of his events. So there's no need for you to pray along, but if you could, in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Direct, we beseech thee, O Lord, all our acts by your holy inspirations, and carry them on by your gracious assistance, that every word and work of ours may always begin from you, and by you be happily ended. We ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen. Mary, seat of wisdom, pray for us. So the Lumen Christi Institute was founded in 1997 by Catholic scholars at the University of Chicago in order to provide a home for the intellectual traditions of the Church on the secular University of Chicago campus, and to provide a forum for good-natured, if sometimes sharp-elbowed debate with the contemporary university about the place of the life of the mind and how it ought to be organized. And for over 25 years, we've done this at the University of Chicago through lectures, master classes, reading groups, symposia, seminars. But since our founding, we've always understood that the life of the mind of the Church, is the inheritance of us all, not just students who happen to be at the University of Chicago for a 4-year or 10-year period. So our cultural forum, yeah, we have some committee on social thought. Go ahead, Sue. So our cultural forum has always desired, from our inception, to bring sophisticated yet accessible lectures on contemporary issues, but in a way that transcend the culture war of the day to the broad lay Catholic public in Chicagoland and beyond, because this inheritance is all of ours. And this, I think, is going to be one of the events that most exemplifies this. I want to say a word about the genesis of this event, and then I'll thank some speakers, and we'll get our two speakers up here. This event began, the idea for this event began, I think, in 2021 when we invited James Matthew Wilson to campus, and he gave a master class on T.S. Eliot's 4 quartets. And it was excellent, just an excellent, excellent master class in which he broke open the book and put it back together. And I was talking to him afterwards, and I said, James, this is the best master class since like 5 or 6 years ago. A certain Mark Shiffman gave a master class on Strauss, MacIntyre, and Pieper. Do you happen to know him? And James was like, know him? He's one of my great friends. We taught for years at Villanova together. He's the secret interlocutor of what was then his most recent book on Irish Catholic poetry. You can sort of see Mark behind everything I'm doing. Yes, of course I know him. I said, oh, yeah, right, yeah, of course, yes, I knew that. But, so the subtitle of this event was born then in 2021, a conversation with Mark Shiffman and James Matthew Wilson, but I didn't yet have the occasion for it. Mark did me the pleasure in 2023 of publishing the book, What is Ideology? So I got the title for the subtitle. And we jumped right on it, and 15 or 16 months later, we have this event right in front of us. Our two, James and Mark, will have a conversation until about 7:15, in which we will have about 15 minutes for Q&A from the audience. But before I hand it over to them, I would like to thank the people who made this event possible. Our host committee, John McEnroe, Noel Moore, Rob and Christine Pluta, St. Mary Byzantine Catholic Church, and the Hank Center for the Catholic Intellectual Heritage at Loyola University Chicago. I'd like to thank Wise Blood Books, which published What is Ideology and is here tonight selling a number of excellent texts, many by James himself. I'd like to thank our Vice Chair, Charles Mullaney, and I would like to give a special thanks to Public Discourse, our co-presenter for this event, the Journal of the Witherspoon Institute. I'm certain many, if not all of you, know Public Discourse and the Witherspoon and all the good work they do at Princeton and in the nation, preserving Catholic and classical heritage in an effort to renew culture today. We've been walking in the same direction for 20 years, and I'm glad that we're finally pulling in the same direction. We put on the same yoke, and we're partnering, and I hope this is the beginning of a long-standing partnership. So what I would like to do is invite R.J. Snell, the editor-in-chief of Public Discourse, up to say a little bit more about the magazine and then introduce our two speakers. So if you could, help me welcome them.
Well, thank you, Austin. Good evening. My name is R.J. Snell. I'm the Director of Academic Programs at the Witherspoon Institute in Princeton, New Jersey, and editor-in-chief of the Public Discourse, which is our online daily journal. The Witherspoon Institute is a fellow traveler with Lumen Christi. We don't do many co-sponsored events. It's not part of our forte to do. But years ago, when I worked in Chicago, I would come down as a young assistant professor at North Park University to everything that Lumen Christi did. And I have a picture of a young me with Jean-Luc Marion and some of my students, which I keep to remember days when I thought I might be Jean-Luc Marion when I got older. Old dreams die hard. So I have great personal affection for Lumen Christi and the work they do. And while Witherspoon and its associated network of about 28 other institutes doesn't really do religion very much, we're not a Catholic or sectarian or confessional organization. We're rooted in the deep tradition of natural law, public reason, and a very Catholic anthropology, or a shared anthropology, of the primacy of the human person, that there are no good politics, no good universities, no good institutions, which at the end of the day do not admire, respect, and work for the dignity and flourishing of the human being created in the image of God. That's what we're about. Public Discourse is a daily journal. We're committed to the idea that there is no moral, no political, no controversial subject that we cannot reason about together. We don't try to own people. We don't try to have clickbait. We don't try to win arguments. We try to foster debate, not only to model how debate works, but because we have a respect for the person, and that truth is a common good. It can be shared with others, and that you possess it does not mean that I cannot. That I possess it does not mean that I cannot share it with you. So I'm very pleased to be co-sponsoring this event tonight, and indeed to be co-sponsoring two of my own dear friends. When they were at Villanova, I taught at Eastern University just down the street, and came to admire both of them enormously. I won't read much of their bios, in part because I'm at the age where I can't read with my glasses on or off, but also because you have the bios. But I'll give you the short versions. Mark Shiffman is currently Associate Professor of Philosophy at St. Patrick's Seminary of the Archdiocese of San Francisco and Director of the Institute for Philosophy, Technology, and Politics there. James Matthew Wilson is Cullen Foundation Chair in English Literature and the founding director of the MFA program in Creative Writing at the University of St. Thomas, Houston. You can read their bios and see their book lists, but I'll say this. I work with a lot of academics. I am an academic. If you know academics, you know that while there may be much information and much learning, there's not always wisdom. Mark and James are both exceptions to that rule, where there's a lot of knowledge, a lot of learning, a lot of academic chops. But the reason they're interesting is not because they know things about T.S. Eliot or MacIntyre or Strauss. The reason they're interesting is because they're both men of integrity and wisdom who know how to teach, who understand the purpose of the university, the purpose of teaching, the purpose of their own writing, and the purpose of scholarship itself. And they do so both with incredible learning, wisdom, and humility. And that's remarkably rare in the world of the academy and deserves all of our gratitude and thanks to them. So I'll invite them both to the dais, and they'll run the conversation from here. Thank you so much to Austin and Lumen Christi, and indeed to all of you.
Well, I have to say, I knew I was coming to Chicago. I didn't know I was coming to an Irish wake. But I'll be crying into my whiskey later, that's for sure. Thank you, RJ, for that beautiful introduction. Let me get this a little farther away. So a couple of things that Austin mentioned are things with which I wanted to begin tonight. And that's, how will I put this? For many years, far too many years, I was, while writing other books, I was writing this long, ridiculously long book called Catholic Modernism and the Irish Avant-Garde, and which finally was published sometime in January. I should have commemorated the moment because it took so bloody long. But anyhow, it was a fairly obscure academic study, but that tried to draw the whole Catholic tradition into conversation with the modern arts. And I had, in the first and the third parts, already had these significant discussions, one about St. Augustine, the City of God, the other about Montaigne and the structures of thought of Middle Platonism. I had in those sections already cited this fellow whose office was across the street, or across the hall from me at the time, named Mark Shiffman, in order to advance my discussion. So then, in a book about Irish poetry, I find myself studying the philosophy of Thomas Jefferson, which is not what you normally intuit, but it makes sense if you read the 500-page book. So, and I say to Mark, Mark, I'm studying Thomas Jefferson for this section of my book on Irish modernism, and he's talking about ideology. What does that mean? And Mark says, I just happen to have a lecture that I've just recently delivered at Villanova University on the subject. And he gave me the lecture, and I said, this is one of the best things I've ever read by you, Mark, but also just, it's truly a great thing. And that began a bit of a campaign to get this piece published. And so I'm very pleased that my colleague at the University of St. Thomas, Joshua Wren, who runs Wise Blood Books, was so generous as to publish a beautiful edition of What is Ideology. But I'm also thrilled that with the publication of that book, we have occasion to talk about what that book, small though it is, says, which I think is so crucial for us at this particular moment to be thinking about and to be contemplating. And so, though it's my duty to ask Mark provocative questions, I'm just going to actually ask him to say a few words to get us started.
Thank you, James. And thank you all for being here. I'm extraordinarily grateful for this event. I am grateful especially to James for being more responsible than anyone else for the fact that this appears in print. So that James's encouragement to work it up and to let it see the light of day was instrumental, was indispensable for that happening. And of course, I'm grateful for all of you turning out tonight, and very, very grateful to the Lumen Christi Institute. And I should say, I don't know, partly as an apologia for myself, the fact that it took me 10 years to get through the University of Chicago is in significant measure due to the fact that when Thomas Levergood started up the Lumen Christi Institute, he kind of roped me into doing all of the nitty-gritty stuff that he couldn't do because he was the idea man and the salesman. So, but those were marvelous times, and Lumen Christi has been extraordinarily important in my own development as a scholar, as a thinker, as a Catholic, and so this is especially marvelous to be here on this occasion. I have prepared some written remarks because I don't like to, if I'm going to say anything stupid, I don't want it to be accidental. This is mostly material that's in the book, though I've kind of streamlined it a little to make it easier to digest, and then also added some reflections at the end that I think are especially relevant to the interests of you here tonight. So my contention in this book is that ideology, the word ideology, gives us a helpful name for a particular form of political thinking, a form which is distorting and destructive, and from which we should all strive to free our minds if we need to, and most of us do. This liberation, however, requires seeing clearly what the word means and why what it names is bad. So the brief remarks I'm going to give here will fall into three parts: a short history of the word ideology, a concise description of how ideological thinking operates, and some remarks about how it is in direct conflict with a Christian understanding of created order and human dignity. We use the word ideology all the time to mean a set of beliefs that provide a rationale for some political agenda. And of course, it's true that political agendas do generally have central organizing ideas, if they're organized agendas. But that doesn't mean that they should all be described as ideologies. These ideas and the way of thinking about politics So we need to know what we're saying when we use this word, and that requires a little bit of linguistic history. Now, this history begins very exactly in 1796, but I think it's more interesting to fast forward 17 years to 1813. In 1813, John Adams wrote a letter to Thomas Jefferson. And in this letter, he was referring to a disagreement they had had years before about the French Revolution. Adams says to Jefferson, "You were well persuaded in your own mind that the nation would succeed in establishing a free republican government. I was as well persuaded in mine that a project of such a government over 25 million people, when 24 million and 500,000 of them could neither write nor read, was as unnatural, irrational, and impracticable as it would be over the elephants, lions, tigers, panthers, wolves, and bears in the royal menagerie at Versailles. Napoleon has lately invented a word which perfectly expresses my opinion at that time and ever since. He calls the project ideology." Now, what Adams is suggesting here is that the word ideology is a really good name for a certain kind of political thinking, one that we might describe as an intellectual scheme of reform that's full of enthusiasm and confidence about its imagined benefits, but which suffers from a lack of any clear vision of relevant political realities. And I think he's right. It's a very good word for that kind of thing. But it hasn't generally turned out that that's how we use ideology in intellectual and academic discourse. So now I'm going to tell that story and come back to the Adams sense of the word. Jefferson, in reading this letter, would know very well that Napoleon did not invent this word. And he would know that in 1796 it was coined in Paris by Antoine de Tracy to describe his theory of how our ideas originate from sense impressions and abstraction. Tracy's theory combines what we would call epistemology and cognitive psychology to propose an individualistic and empiricist account of human intelligence. And Jefferson thought this was great. He had Tracy's works translated into English and published in America, which was there weren't a lot of books published in America at that point. Tracy in this is following in the footsteps of John Locke, and he's reaching similar conclusions about politics. That is to say, a politics of liberal individualism that seems to follow from these premises about knowledge and where knowledge and our ideas come from. And what Napoleon is expressing is scorn for this whole thing by using the word sarcastically. He's deriding the kind of deductive argumentation for political arrangements based on rationalistic philosophical premises by people who don't actually know how to make things happen like Napoleon does. So this is the sort of usually unknown background, the origins of this word. But of course, the real history of the word as we know it begins with Karl Marx. In 1846, Marx co-authored with Friedrich Engels a short book called The German Ideology. And this book criticized the dominant philosophy of the time of Hegel about the formation of ideas and the relationship of ideas to practical realities, that ideas somehow are the fundamental thing and they get played out in the world according to their inner logic, they get institutionalized and so on. Marx, in criticizing this theory, was using the word ideology pretty much in continuity with the way it originated. It's a term for a theory of ideas, and one that he's criticizing. And Marx's own theory is that ideas don't precede practice, they don't lead to practice. Rather, ideas are the products of practical and economic realities. And those economic realities shape our worldviews and generate the ideas that we have about the world, by Marx's account. The ideas of the dominant class are unconsciously tailored to justify their domination. In Marxist thought, then, ideology comes to mean the legitimating worldview imposed by the dominant class. Now, Marx himself insisted that these ideas were not worth taking seriously in themselves, since when finally the communist revolution set the whole economic order straight, those ideas would just disappear. But a century later, the Italian Marxist Antonio Gramsci recognized that the battle of ideas that legitimate different social and political agendas was a real site of conflict with real effects in the world. And in spelling this out, he gave birth to what we now know as cultural Marxism, which seeks to delegitimate capitalism and liberal order through ideological combat by taking over cultural institutions like universities, media, and entertainment, and installing the correct ideology to lead the way into the glorious future. So that's the history of how the word is mainly used, and then we just kind of use it indiscriminately to talk about people's ideas about politics. Now, this critical sense in which Adams used it made a comeback in the middle of the 20th century, primarily through Hannah Arendt, the political philosopher, in her study from 1950, The Origins of Totalitarianism. According to Arendt, the true character of ideology comes clearly into view only in the middle of the 20th century when totalitarian movements come to power and, as she says, proceed to change reality in accordance with their ideological claims. She says, an ideology is quite literally what its name indicates. It is the logic of an idea. Its thought movement does not spring from experience, but is self-generated. And it transforms the one and only point that is taken and accepted from experienced reality, like, there is class conflict in a certain sense, right, into an axiomatic premise. Once it has established its premise, its point of departure, experiences no longer interfere with ideological thinking, nor can it be taught by reality. So when they attain power, then, ideological movements treat human affairs, as Arendt says, with a consistency that exists nowhere in the realm of reality. And Marxism is a very good example. Fascism, Nazism, Randian libertarianism, all drastic simplifications of reality in accord with a very narrow set of ideas. This demand for unrealistic consistency in human affairs determines how ideology operates. It makes ideology inherently violent in at least three ways that I would like to describe very briefly. First, ideology, of course, is violent against defenders of the order that it seeks to replace. And it has invented the abusive word reactionaries to describe them. This was invented in the French Revolution. Ideology is also necessarily violent against those who merely question its certainties. Since those who believe in the ideology are convinced that all that's required to arrive at the social order that rights all wrongs of history is for everyone to adhere to the ideology and behave according to its dictates. Anyone who raises doubts and encourages others to doubt is impeding the rectification of human social relations that will finally reconcile all things. And finally, ideology is violent against reality itself. Hating any truth in the order of things that stands in its way, as much as it hates those who speak truths about the limitations of its plan. Nature is not allowed to be other than what the logic and aims of the ideology require it to be. Ideology is thus violently anti-traditional, anti-philosophical, and anti-natural. It is compelled to force everything to fit into the image of the person and society dictated by the ideology's vision, and it is compelled to punish or eliminate what does not fit. I'll conclude by drawing some contrasts then with a Catholic vision of reality. Since ideology seeks to substitute a structure of the mind for the order of creation that has been given to us, ideology is also inherently Gnostic. Part of what defines Gnosticism as a heresy is that it denies the goodness of the created order. In this respect, ideology is inescapably at odds with the tradition of Christian humanism that responds to God's creation with gratitude, humility, and respect. Ideology substitutes its agenda for practical judgment, which would recognize a complex order of goods and would draw upon extensive experience to understand how to navigate those goods and their competing claims. Ideology replaces conscience with its demands for enforcing its ideals and punishing all opposition. Ideology replaces love of truth and recognition of mystery with enforced doctrinal purity and reductive concepts and slogans. Ideology replaces eternal beatitude in the presence of God with utopian zeal for man's redemption of history, and thus replaces Christian eschatological hope with revolutionary optimism about human solutions. It replaces respect for the dignity of the human person with celebration of a new humanity required for its perfected social and political order. And if you take all those things together, it would seem to suggest that when Pope Francis uses the term gender ideology, for which he receives much criticism, he actually knows what he's saying. Thank you.
So what I like about those remarks is there's a hint of the sequel to the first book already present in there. So there's even more than is in the book, though there's much in the book that you didn't get a chance to touch on tonight. Since it's my job to lob some softballs at you.
And you conveniently have a copy of the book.
I do. It's, I want to start with this because what you said was very rich, but I think it would be helpful, especially for people who haven't had a chance to read the book yet, to think about this, is you gave us your sort of, how would I put it? So the postmodern writer Michel Foucault is infamous for his genealogies, which comes out of Nietzsche originally. The idea that every idea that claims to be true is not really true. And you can show that it's not true simply by historicizing it, by retracing the story of it. And one of the things you do in the book that's so interesting is you give us a genealogy of ideology, but the idea of doing these genealogies is ideological. So you give us a genealogy of ideology so as to cancel ideology, right? That's the end of my efforts to be witty tonight. Here's the softball.
Well, it is well said.
Just take everybody through this real quickly from Tracy forward. Mm-hmm. What are the 3 iterations of ideology?
So the first, let me first say what the 3 meanings of the word have in common at a very high level of abstraction, which is that they're all talking about a system of ideas and a way of understanding how we think, right? A proposed way of understanding how we think that has political consequences for reshaping the world. Right? Now, the first version is, this as I say, a kind of cognitive psychology that's, extensively developed already in Hobbes and Locke and the sort of foundational figures of individualist political philosophy. And lo and behold, its conclusions are individualist political philosophy, right? And Jefferson thinks that's fantastic. And the letter that you're referring to in your original opening remarks there, Jefferson is asked by a nephew of his to sort of sketch out a curriculum of philosophy, right? And he says, well, ideology political economy, jurisprudence, right, and ethics, basically, right? And in that schema, he's following Tracy's suggestion that, look, this new science of what our ideas, where they come from, this should replace what in the Catholic tradition theology and metaphysics do as providing a foundation for every other science, right? And Jefferson's entirely on board with that project. And yeah, it's a very Lockean project of a kind of, and you know, this has kind of made a comeback in recent decades in a lot of philosophy departments, this combination of cognitive psychology and epistemology as the foundation of understanding what it means to think, right, and to know. The Marxist version is mostly used critically, that is to say, there are lots and lots of different ideologies that all are justifications for different oppressive social and economic orders. They present themselves as if they're truths about the order of things, but they're just a representation of reality that fits, that makes it seem as if reality justifies this political and economic order. And as I've just characterized what Tracy's version is, that's an accurate description of what he's doing, right? The sort of implicit meaning of ideology, if you generalized it. Right? So, and communism itself, and this is very clear in Gramsci, communism itself is an ideology in that sense. But the argument is that it's the only ideology that fits with a just order. But of course, then you have the problem of, well, so where do we get our understanding of what justice is? Well, from the ideology, right? So it's fundamentally circular in that way. And so then Arendt, in the spirit of Adams, is looking at all these ways of describing what political thinking is and saying, no, that's not political thinking. That's basically technocratic thinking, right? That's looking at human phenomena as if they're a kind of, you know, engineering problem to solve, and if you can bring sufficient force and organization to solving them by transforming human life entirely to fit this outcome, that's what they're aiming to do, and that's fundamentally doomed to fail because it's an attempt to impose an order on reality that is not the order of reality itself, that is not fundamentally what's given to us for us to know, to love, to work within.
So I was born in the 70s, and doesn't make me an ideologist of disco or anything, but it does lead me to observe the following. Thanks for those of you who laughed at that. So it does lead me to think the following. I was born well after the age when you could go to a college campus and see some guy in a sport coat and a bow tie wearing a button on his lapel that said, "Please do not immanentize the eschaton," and which is, in my view, still the best critique of ideology that's ever been issued, because what could be better than a button? But that comes originally from a fellow whose name is conspicuously absent from your book, which is Eric Voegelin. So here's I think how I want to frame this question. Russell Kirk, who was a great admirer of Voegelin's, referred to his idea of conservatism in the conservative mind as the negation of ideology. And you talk a little bit about Burke. You don't mention Voegelin, but I can hear him in the background. But if you could say a few words, what does it mean to talk about negating ideology? What's the outside to the inside that Arendt described?
Well, the outside involves at least two dimensions, and ultimately three, and the three that I've sort of talked about ideology doing violence against, right? So certainly the Burkean observation in opposition to the rationalism of the French Revolution is that all of our thinking and most of what's sound in it come to us from traditions that we've received, that we don't, it's not our business to like go back to the like fundamental rational principles and justify everything in that tradition. We see from experience and from living what's good in what we've received, and we may see some shortcomings that need to be addressed. So that's an entirely different way of thinking about human order. And implicit in that way of thinking is the second dimension, which is understanding practical reasoning properly, right? The practical reasoning is not, okay, here are my premises, and here's what the conclusions of them are, and therefore I'm going to make everything fit that, right? Practical reasoning acknowledges that we are choosing beings with limited knowledge and in a sense live in a world of so many possible goods that we can't simply prioritize one set of goods and make everything turn out great on that basis, right? That political thinking, that practical thinking is always situated and dealing with real situations in which there are multiple goods in play and people attached to different goods in the political order, that in some way you want to do justice to this variety, both within the order of, the moral life and the gift of being and goodness, right? But also within complex interrelations between human beings who are very different and who are not made to fit into one mold in that way. Mm-hmm. And then that leads to the third alternative, which is understanding that the reality and the depth and the mystery of being, of created being, because it's ultimately grounded in the Creator who infinitely surpasses it and is infinitely deeper than it, is always in some way fundamentally mysterious. We're never going to get our minds really around it. We're never going to wrestle it down to have the kind of final understanding that's going to allow us to manipulate everything and sort it all out.
So the first great critic of ideology was Edmund Burke, and you mentioned Burke in passing in the book. I want to at least give you a chance to say a few words about what Burke saw in the French Revolution. I'm going to, rather than trying to say anything, because I really want to, but tell us a little bit about Burke. Because this was an amazing moment. 50 years later, after the French Revolution, William Wordsworth, in his poem *The Prelude*, which was first written, in 1805, but then he revised it 45 years later in 1850 or so. And one of the things that he did in the Prelude was insert about 14 lines of just praise for Edmund Burke as this great prophet who saw what the young Wordsworth, who was in France at the time of the Revolution, couldn't see, which was how awful the French Revolution was going to be. Right. So tell us a little bit about Burke and his critique of ideology.
Well, there's potentially some disagreement about Burke on this point, which is to say, there are two versions of Burke, right? And you might call these the, what do we want to call them? The sort of soft conservative version of Burke, where just take things slow, right? Don't try to change everything at once, gradualism, but not necessarily with any kind of fundamental grounding in principles of order that are natural, right? I don't think that's a good representation of Burke. I think implicitly, right, Burke was a sort of Irish Catholic temper of mind, and I think Burke in a certain way is one of the great political apologists for Catholic natural law, and is able to frame it in a way that doesn't, it's not like throwing Thomas Aquinas at you. It's giving you the the manifestation of this understanding of that through the practices and traditions that we over time discover are fruitful for human life, right, we, in a certain sense, find our way to these basic natural law principles and to how they can be manifested in institutions and human relations and all these things, right? And it's not a kind of process of, okay, I figured out the first principles, right? and everything has to now conform to that, right? It's in a certain sense, it's a dialogue across the generations, and an inherited dialogue, very much like, you know, the development of doctrine in Catholicism, right? So I think there's a premise, underlying premise that Burke, you know, since mostly he's talking to Protestants, right, and of various kinds, and some, you know, questionably religious liberal, early liberals, that he's finding a way to make this older traditional Catholic understanding of moral reality make sense to his contemporaries.
I like the two definitions of Burke there, so because it's helping me think about one aspect of this book that I hadn't appreciated fully. So ideological thinking is the idea of we start from, as I put it, certain logical premises that are grounded in nothing but our own logic, our own reason. And we say, these should be the case. And then ideology becomes the political program that imposes these abstracted logical ideas on reality. And so it does two things simultaneously. On the one hand, it's ahistorical and anti-historical. So the soft Burke, it doesn't defer to the past and to precedent. It thinks that, well, now we have the key to history, so we can just do what we want. But it's also anti-transcendent. You got this, you conveyed this with the sense of that non-ideological thinking assumes that we're born into the world. So not only are we born into history, but we're born into a world that is not our creation, nor the creation of our ancestors. It has a natural order to which we need to defer and which we need to discern if we're to live well and to think truthfully.
Yes. And we respond artfully to it.
Yes. Yeah. So that reminds me of two things. People don't often associate Pope John Paul II and Pope Francis together, aside from the word Pope. But
and some not even that.
Yeah, that's true. I have seen them. But give me a second. Okay. But you hit on something earlier with the critique of gender ideology, the idea of an abstract principle of gender is a social construct. That's our idea. We can impose that on reality, and we'll reconform the world to accept a principle that was never a part of it before, but should have been. That's Francis's critique of calling it gender ideology. Alistair McIntyre, and I was talking with somebody earlier tonight about McIntyre, but yes, McIntyre, oh, there you are, yes. So McIntyre, in his essay from the early 90s called Can We Learn What Veritatis Splendor, John Paul II's encyclical, has to teach? It's a wonderful essay, but one of the things that's beautiful is at the end of it, it says, what John Paul II is telling us is that we are culture-transcending animals. So we're animals. We're part of history. We're part of culture. We have bodies. We live in the world, but we finally transcend them. And then, so this is something I didn't plan to bring up, but Mark's got me thinking about it. So Mark used to teach a class at Villanova called World, which I inherited from him, and made a few modifications to. And one of the modifications I made was to add the encyclical Laudato Si on the climate crisis into this course. And one of the reasons I added that encyclical, which I thought had some paragraphs that just kind of raised eyebrows for me, but one of the reasons I wanted to add it into the course was because Pope Francis echoes there in a profound way what John Paul II says about us being culture transcending. That encyclical, if you've read it, is pretty much continuous despair and dismay over every aspect of the contemporary world. I mean, air conditioning gets a whole paragraph. And not in a good way. Not like, oh, it's cool in here as I'm writing this. But it's in why? Why world? Why is there air conditioning? So, but that encyclical has this brilliant thread through it. And that continuously, Francis goes back to recognizing that it's the human capacity to perceive truth, to know the good, and to contemplate beauty that saves us when all of history seems so faded by a material necessity that's going to lead to apocalypse. And yet there's still this freedom. And what kind of freedom is it? It's the freedom, it's the capacity to think outside of ideology. Okay, so I had a question there, but I lost it in going on so long. So I have another question for you, which is this. The hero in your book comes from somewhat unexpected quarters, and that's Ralph Ellison. So just tell us about Ralph Ellison, the author of The Invisible Man.
Well, Ralph Ellison wrote one of the greatest novels in America. It's an incredibly rich novel, and one of the primary threads of that novel is precisely the narrator, the narrator goes through, right, he's a young black man living in the South, and he goes to this black college, and he really believes in the whole kind of sell job that the college is giving, but he discovers, that by believing that, he actually gets into trouble and, has to go through this whole journey of self-discovery. And a lot of that journey consists of trying to latch on to a kind of vision that organizes the world for you. And eventually he finds himself drawn to this Marxist group. He becomes a spokesman for them and an organizer for them. And gradually he realizes how fundamentally at odds this view that seems to be promising this, this future of equality, of all, like race doesn't matter, and right, but how it's fundamentally anti-cultural, right? And he comes to appreciate what he himself never previously appreciated when he was trying to be something else, right? The rich cultural heritage of Christianity and music and story, right, that he as a black American inherits, and how it's a kind of life-giving, rich way of engaging reality that's not trying to narrow it down to some, optimistic vision, but is really confronting the whole depth of, grief and sorrow and tragedy and comedy and everything about human life. And it's when his portrayal, Ellison's portrayal of the process his protagonist goes through of being totally sucked into this ideological project and believing that he's participating in the redemption of history, right? And this is such a incredibly energizing feeling. It makes you feel like you're part of the biggest thing ever. And his gradual being kind of jarred out of that is a very, very powerful description and portrayal of the power of ideology to really tap into and lay a hold of our fantasies and desires for a perfect world, right? Mm-hmm. And use them to destroy our humanity and enslave us to something inhuman. So,
I'd say one last quick question, and then we're going to open things up to the attendees here tonight. I'm going to kind of repeat a question I asked earlier, okay. And it's because I'm thinking most of us have seen encampments of ideology in the last few weeks, sometimes being broken up by the police. It's possible in our age which is subject not just to the logic of ideas, but the sensation of continuous social media, to occupy with a sense of complete justification and moral claims, and moral superiority, a position that effectively is defending rape, torture, and genocide. So we live in an age that's more ideological, it seems, than at any time since the Russian Revolution. So you gave us suggestions of what the principles of non-ideological thinking are. But if I can just ask kind of a different version of the same question for people who are just sitting here tonight and thinking how to understand our contemporary age, what do we need to do in order to think well in a way that genuinely encounters truth, goodness, and beauty and does not subject itself to the ideological program that you've been describing? Save civilization now.
Go to a lot of Lumen Christi events. Yeah, the short answer is that's really what the next book is about. But I'll just say one quick thing about that. Because I've been thinking a lot about this, and some people talk about us being in a kind of post-ideological age, and I think there's something to that in the sense that what we see on is sort of the sort of mental content of the people engaged in these protest movements is not actually a vision of an order of anything, right? It has some of the kind of fundamental features of the insistence of radical transformation of reality right now. Right? It inherits this belief from the ideological mind that this is how you confront political realities, but it's lost any sense that you have to have a vision of order that justifies anything, right? So it's, in a certain sense, it's the worst of both worlds, right? Because it's all the bad kind of reflexes and attitudes, sort of destructive character of ideology that thinks, okay, if these people are doing it, it doesn't count as violence. And if these people, the colonial oppressors are doing it, does, right? It has all of that kind of doublethink, but it has none of the kind of rational structural coherence that you could actually enter into some kind of dialogue with and say, no, here's how you see that this can't be right. So it's in that sense, I think there's a lot of right, post-ideological doesn't mean non-ideological. It just means like the remnants of what was a kind of energetic determination to have a worked out vision that just is in kind of flailing zombie mode without that.
We have time for about 2 questions. Let's make it 3. 2 or 3 questions.
Not really a question, just a comment how amazing you both are. Just the speaking and the message and your delivery was very impressive, so thank you.
Thanks. More questions like that, please.
10, we could have 10 like that.
Hi, Mark. Hi, James. Father Andrew here. By virtue of the fact that you have this beautiful marquee up here, you are public intellectuals. And so my question for you is, what stops each of you from being ideologues as you have diagnosed it in this conversation? What's if you can, I know you fairly well. I would think you're not. But what's the break for you?
You go.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
Me?
Yeah.
Well, first of all, I've been called an ideologue. I thought, what, me? But that's a good question. So so Joshua Wren's sitting in the other room with a book table, and it has a bunch of books by me that you could buy. But one book that's not on the table is my book of poems, The Strangest of the Good, which has a poem called Revolutions, which is a ballad about wokeness. I know that's not great material for poetry, but it kind of worked out. But in that ballad, I gotten through it. You know, the ballad sort of the description is, well, they just say we just need to crush a few more bones and everything will be great, right? And the end of the poem is sort of the response of someone who's standing outside of this, I hope myself, as a non-ideologue, of not endorsing the revolutions. What am I supposed to do? And I wonder if that poem ends in a way that's really disappointing for the reader, but for me is totally satisfactory, which is just got to keep reading books and looking at things and try to be human in the world. And I just, my counter-revolution is to try to be a good father, go to church on Sunday, give Father Andrew some tithes, no, and then I think in addition to that, you know, I write poems, and you know, they're not going to get on MTV, but I'm hoping that the same thing will happen for other people that happened for me when I was 18, 19, 20 years old, which is that I'll open up somebody will open up a random book someday and say, hey, that's a pretty good poem. That makes me think about the world. And that's all you can do, because reality is program resistant. And so you just got to try to make good things.
My answer is James is a philosophical poet, and I'm a poetic philosopher, and that's sufficient.
Thank you, gentlemen, for the wonderful discussion. So the Jacobins knew what the target was, right? The clergy, the order of tradition, and Burke knew this too. So my question to you is, the tradition and the sacraments really are both the target of the ideologues and the antidote to ideology. So if you could just expound on that.
Think of what you just said. I mean, you basically just summed up my long response to Mark. We're simultaneously historical and culture transcending animals. In other words, we have tradition and we have the Eucharist.
Yep.
And that's,
And it's
Yeah.
given and it's unearned,
yeah.
and they know that, you know, that's all powerful, which is why whether it's Gramsci, the March of the Institutions, or whether it's Marx with his dialectic, or it's the Jacobins with their chaos, or for that matter, Lenin, who decided who preferred the Jacobin techniques to the niceties of Hegelian dialectic. They knew what the target was. And so we know what the answer is, because they're telling. I mean, we know someone else has told us, but we know that they're telling us what they're most worried about.
Yeah, the condensed in a real living, loving, contemplative engagement with the Eucharist reveals to us in a palpable and a visible way some fundamental truths about the order of reality, about the meaning of our desires, the meaning of our sufferings, and fundamentally what violence is. And all of those things are sort of endless lessons for us, right?
Thank you both. My hand hurts from taking notes. This is fascinating. My question is conviction possible without ideology? I can hear my students objecting or perhaps raising the question that no one can make the kind of sacrifices and efforts necessary to make the world a better place unless they have a passionate commitment to an image of the way the world should be and a willingness to do what it takes to make it that way. And I'm curious how you think about that, perhaps the sort of whatever they lack in nuance, sort of holy foolishness, how that doesn't slip into ideology.
Edmund Burke's a good example of that. And I know I seem very mild-mannered here, but I've always loved to punch people in the face, and I'm willing to punch people in the face not because of ideas I have, but because of things that are real that I love. You don't have. ideology shouldn't enter into our lives at all. And that's one of the great things about what Mark is saying is that, I remember one of the first students I ever taught, she had an article, or she wrote an essay for my class that said, this ideology is a bad ideology. We need a new ideology. And I just thought, that's not, you're using the word wrong, but Mark Shiffman isn't going to write this book for 20 more years, so how am I going to tell you? I love G.K. Chesterton, and the reason G.K. Chesterton was so wonderful is he just asked you to look at real things that are worth loving and to defend those. And sometimes you will defend things that have deep faults. In fact, without exception, you will. But those things still deserve to be defended because they are good things that are capable of being loved. And I think the best thing to do is to be honest about the faults where they are present, but then to stand in defense of them.
And I would add, the only way you can make the world a better place is by becoming a better human being. And that's a lot of work that doesn't have really much to do with making other things into things that they're not.
But it is kind of interesting, Chesterton's non-ideological, and so's Lumen. There's no Lumen ideology, right? It's just encountering reality and so forth. So
Yeah.
They're some of the best.
So I was just thinking about this the other day because for public discourse, I was writing a book review about a book that attacks Newman. And I thought, clearly it's a bad book. But the critique was just talking past what Newman's doing. One of the things that I think, at this point in my life, I'm convinced that the best way to understand Newman is that he understood that in post-Enlightenment reasoning, there are all kinds of attacks on Christianity, and there are very intricately reasoned ways of defending belief. All the anticipations of liberal Protestantism. Oh, it's a myth. We just interpret things like moral, just anything, any sort of hedging, as Charles Taylor puts it, any kind of strategic retreat to just retain the justification of believing in God, even though, no, we have to let this go or that go. And Newman thought, no, that can't be the right answer. The everyday person who goes to church or who goes down his knees and says his prayers, that's the Christianity we have to defend. And so I have to explain to the world why these people are right to do what they do. If you can't defend, my grandpa going to Mass on the south side of Chicago in 1950, then you can't defend Christianity.
Now, I appreciate Noel and James and Mark simultaneously noticing that I really want to end the event at 7:30, and the only way to let me continue is if they talk about Newman. So there is more conversation to be had. I know there are a number of questions that still want to be asked, and that's why the open bar stays open. But the event will close right now. So if you could please with me thank James and Mark and everyone else who made this event.
Well done, sir.